Hello and welcome to the second lesson in this course. We're going to learn how to open a new document in Sketch, and we'll take a look at its interface. When you open Sketch, the first thing you see is a window that gives you a few options. On the left, there are some options to see the latest updates, subscribe to the newsletter, etc. At the top, there are two options: recent documents and templates. The first allows us to access the most recent documents we created in Sketch. The second is very useful when we're working on an interface or icons for certain platforms like iOS or Android, as we can find lots of elements created especially for these. The first thing that stands out when we create a new document is that the interface is so clear, tidy and clean. There are four main blocks on the interface. The toolbar. This is on the top. Don't worry if it doesn't look exactly like mine. We'll see how you can adjust it later on. In this bar, you have all the tools the software offers to work on shapes, texts, scaling tools, spools, etc. The inspector. From here, we have access to our objects, artboard, pages, etc. And we can adjust the settings of our current layer or organize and rename all the elements. In the top part of the inspector, you'll find the properties. You can adjust the properties of the elements you have selected. These will change depending on the type of elements. The canvas's size is infinite. We can move to wherever we want on it, so you're completely free to configure your workspace however you like. If you press the spacebar, then click and hold, the Hand tool will appear. This will help us move the canvas. It's a very comfy tool. So, we've seen an overview of Sketch's interface. I've reset the toolbar, so this is the default one that appears the first time you open the program. So this is what you should see right now. I'll first explain the program's default tools, and later I'll show you how to configure the bar to your liking and adapt it to your style of working. The first tool we'll see is the Insert Elements tool. Here, we can work with the pen, the pencil, we can insert shapes, texts, images, artboards, but we'll see this later on. We have the Slice tool, which allows us to export certain elements or sections of our project to use later on in front-end development. We also have the option of inserting symbols or text styles. The second block we have is the one that will help us group or ungroup elements. I'm not going to explain right now how each tool works, as we'll see that in more detail later on. This is the Symbol tool. This is the Zoom. These are all the shape editing and transforming tools, for example Edit, Transform, Rotate and Flatten, that we'll also see further on. Masking and Scaling tools. Here you can find all the tools related to boost, add, subtract, intersect. The tools that help us raise or lower layers or put some on top of or underneath each other. Here are the mirror options that are a good idea to buy separately. They let us see our design in real time, on the iPhone or the iPad, but not on Android. There's also the cloud where sketch files are stored. This tool allows us to see our design in pixels, see or hide the rulers, and show or adjust the grids. So, up to here, we've seen the default tools on the toolbar, but how can we adjust the toolbar to our liking and to our way of working? Well, it's actually quite simple. Just right-click on the toolbar and three options will appear. The first is to view icons and text. The second, only icons, and the third only shows us the names of the tools. And the fourth option is to personalize this bar with the tools the program has. We can simply drag a tool and it's ready to use on our toolbar, or we could even reset the bar by dragging up the default one we have below. To configure our space in the toolbar even better, we have two important elements: fixed spacing and flexible spacing. Dragging, we can create spaces between groups of tools that we need or want to separate. So it's as easy as dragging the tools that we want or we need, and if we need or want to separate them, we can also just drag to differentiate the blocks from one another. And what about the opposite? What if we don't need a tool on the toolbar? Just take the tool and drag it out. This way it's eliminated from the bar. Remember, if you want to restore the toolbar, just select the default one below. Drag it into our toolbar and it will be restored. Also remember that if you right-click on the toolbar, you open the drop-down menu with options to view and personalize the bar. The first thing we'll do is create a rectangle, and automatically Sketch puts this into a layer. Sketch does this with any element you create. There are no such thing as empty layers on Sketch. The same goes for our text. Select the text tool, click on the canvas and type username. Then select and move this layer. Press Escape or click on any empty space on the canvas. See how Sketch places it on a new layer. Notice how, if you place the cursor over the layers, this eye icon appears. This icon hides or lets you see the layer. Here, the duplicate option makes a copy of the selected element on a new layer, just above the original element, so I can move it underneath. This way, I've created a very basic interface with a header, a footer and a username. Why have I made this? First, I'll double-click on each layer to rename them, and then I place the header layer above the footer. To do this, click on it and drag it until you see a line with a blue circle where you want to drop it. Now I'll show you another tool to organize yourself, the group. Select the first layer you want to group and pressing on it while holding down Shift, click on the second layer you want to add to the group. Then right-click and select Group Layers. You can also do this with the shortcut Command-G. Another organization tool is the artboard. It wouldn't make sense to work on an interface or an icon without a defined area to adjust our design to. Just click on Insert and select the Artboard tool. Then click and hold to create the board you need for your design. Automatically, the artboard I made groups all the elements inside of it. If you make the design bigger to adjust it to the artboard, see how the artboard groups layers, groups, or groups of groups. We'll continue with organizing our space. So I can duplicate the artboards to have two. I can move them and place them wherever I like. So how inside the same page you can have and group artboards, layers and groups. So I've just introduced the term page. Pages are one of the main elements in Sketch. These pages can gather the artboards that could be the screens of the interface I'm designing, for example. I can have as many pages as I like or as I need. We can do this with this menu. In this case, I'll rename my first page for Android, then I'll duplicate it and I call it iOS. So I now have two pages, one for Android and the other for iOS. And at the same time in iOS, for example, I have a perfect organization into artboards, groups and layers. So this is a valid way of working that you can use when creating your projects. Remember, layers are the minimum unit of organization. We can organize these into groups and subgroups that in turn can be contained or not in an artboard, which can go inside the pages that, as we said, are the top of the pyramid in our organization. If you remember, you can find this on the right-hand side of the interface. It's one of Sketch's most important elements. Thanks to the inspector, we can modify the different elements we have selected and give them certain styles or designs. First, we're going to make a rectangle. As I said, the properties shown change depending on what kind of element we select. In this case, it shows us what properties we can adjust for a shape. We can see some of them, like position and size. I can modify these and see how it affects the shape. I could even transform it, rotate it, or use the border radius property. The opacity too. Here are the values for the fill. I can also modify it, add borders, adjust the size, and I can even decide if I want the border to be internal, external, or centered. Here we have the shadows. I can also modify the values of these and see the different results. I can also adjust the inner shadow from here as well as the inner glow, although this one no longer exists in the latest versions of Sketch. Finally, I can play around with effects like blur, for example. Now let's create a text layer. Remember, either click somewhere on the empty canvas or press Escape. See now how if we select one element or another, the properties in the inspector change. Some could stay the same like the position, size, transformation, but when we select the text, we see typical properties of a text element like font type, size, alignment, width, etc. For example, we are going to change the size. We can also change the color of the font or the fill and decide whether to apply a stroke or not. Here, I can also decide if to apply an inner or outer shadow, etc. But the important thing is that you see that some properties only depend on the element that is selected. Now the best idea is for you to try this out with different elements. Explore the options the inspector gives you for each element. Get to know them so you can master them. Another important point to mention is that all these options and values that you can find for the different elements respect CSS logic. So I can copy all the work I do in my project by copying CSS styles and taking them to the CSS part when we're working on the front-end development, and the size, shadows, effects and so on will be respected. If you remember, in previous lessons, we talked about how the canvas is an infinite space where we can organize our work and designs freely. The first thing we should know is how to move around. So we can move around with the mouse just as I'm doing now. We can also press the spacebar, and clicking on the mouse without letting go, we can drag to move around. This is more than enough for you to organize your work. But what happens when you want to work in a defined space? That's where the artboard comes in. You can insert an artboard with this button here at the top or by pressing A on your keyboard. Also, you have an icon here in the toolbar if you previously configured it. I'll press A and you see that the inspector property options change and give us a series of new options. We can insert an artboard directly from various devices like iOS, Android, from a web design, or even from standard paper sizes. Imagine that in this case you would like to insert an artboard for an iPhone 7 Plus. Well, simply by selecting it, it's created on the canvas. As I said, the artboard is a special element that helps us organize our workspace, but it's also an element that's represented graphically within our canvas. Everything that we work on inside it is organized around it. Another way of inserting them directly would be to click on the canvas and while holding, move to create an artboard of the size we need. See how the inspector now gives us different options for the position, size, orientation, etc. Moving the artboard is very simple. Just select it with the mouse and move it around the canvas. It's also easy to place elements onto the artboard. Simply select them and drag them onto it. If a part of the object is outside of the artboard, it won't be seen. To remove elements is just as easy. Again, dragging them off the artboard removes them. By default, the rulers in Sketch are hidden. To see them, go to View, Canvas, Show Rulers. Or you can press Ctrl R. These rulers help us measure, but they also bring out the guides. If we place the cursor over them and click, we can see the guides. The guides help me structure my design. To get rid of them, all you have to do is drag them up to the left and release, and they'll disappear from our document. The next element is the grid, which you can find in the toolbar and pressing Show Grid. The grid helps us with our designs. We can fit it inside them easily. You can adjust the grid clicking on the same icon as before, and you see here that you can modify the size of the 4 main lines and the color of these. You can adapt it to the needs of your design at any moment. The last tool we see in this lesson is the layout. This is another structure that helps us lay out our design correctly. For example, when working on a website, it gives us the necessary column system to organize our design, header, etc. So we'll use the layout as a base to position the elements and easily understand what the final design will look like. Just like the grid, we can configure the layout from the same icon. We can modify the maximum width, the number of columns, the getter size, which is the space between the columns in our design. All these tools that we've seen are very oriented to interface design as well as icon design, which is really the aim of the software. To do this, go to File, Revert to, and you see the option to load the last saved version of the project or to search through all the versions that Sketch generated in the time you've been working on the project. If you click on the second one, you can see how Sketch generates versions. This is if we need to go back in time at some point in the project. On the right, you have the version history. To load this, just select and hit Restore. Or the opposite, if you want to continue with the current document, you find it on the left of the screen. Just select and press Done. That's how easy it is to manage our versions on Sketch. I'll see you for the next lesson.